Perfecto, ahí anda. Buenos días a todos. Un gusto.
Good morning, everyone. It is a pleasure to greet you and have you here in this last session of the Energy Week of OLADE here in Montevideo. First, I would like to thank the organization. I would like to thank the Ministry of Industry, Energy, and Mining of Uruguay. I want to thank OLADE. I want to thank the IDB, the IRENA Investment Fund, for this magnificent event. We are really happy for how it went. We had high-level presentations all week long, and this panel won't be an exception. Throughout the week, we have discussed several topics, and today we want to continue working, talking about a central topic, which is the topic of the demand. We want to talk about the vision about the demand. So for that, I would like to invite, as a moderator of this panel on the challenges to tackle sustainable development of aviation in Latin America, Pedro de la Fuente. Pedro de la Fuente is a senior manager of external affairs and sustainability, and he has over 15 years of experience in the sector. And he has a master's degree in aerospatial sustainability science. So it is a true pleasure to be yielding the floor to Pedro so that he can share with you who the rest of the panel will be. Thank you, Gaston. Thank you, everyone. It is a pleasure to be here representing the International Aviation Transportation, the IATA. We are the largest organization that represents the aviation companies of the world. The IATA was established in 1945, and it was created as a part of the airline's legacy to have states comply with their commitments. We are not a standard creating organization, but we do issue recommended practices. So we try to harmonize regulations so that it is easier for people to have access to aviation and for the work of airlines to be easier every day. We have been working with OLADE since last year when we signed an MOU to foster sustainable aviation fuels. And although at the global level there is a lot of knowledge about this topic, at the Latin American level, this is just getting started. And what we're trying to do is we're trying to build synergies so that we can take this outside of the aviation field and share it with producers and governments to foster the energy transition in our sector. Why do we want to do this? Because nowadays, if we look at aviation, we see that there is no alternative for conventional fuel. However, we are one of the only sectors at the global level that is committed to getting zero net emissions CO2 by 2050. We have signed many multilateral agreements at the state level. We have committed to the Paris Agreement because domestic aviation needs to be decarbonized by 2050. And then at the level of the OAC, we have the international airline agreements for international flights. There is a really interesting, significant difference here, and that's because 62% of all the emissions from aviation happens in international aviation territories, so there is no jurisdiction for those emissions. And so that's why the OAC brings together airlines and international flights and creates standards so that we eliminate that 62% of emissions. Now, without further ado, I will yield the floor to Agustin Deara. Agustin will give us a brief introduction to this topic, and then we will represent the panel. Agustin, you have the floor. Thank you, Pedro. I'm going to share a presentation with you, and I won't speak for more than 5 minutes, I promise. And then Pedro will tell you a couple more things about the net zero commitment of the sector by 2050. 65% of the reduction of equivalent CO2 will come from SAF, and then there's another set of measures that Pedro will discuss. And now we're talking here about the SAF, knowing that we have different types of aviation fuels, where we have low carbon aviation fuels, where we have other fuels such as electricity and other alternatives. And alternative number one is SAF, and to your right you can see the different carbon sources in raw materials that can be used to produce biofuels. And for those of you who are not specialists, SAF is a type of fuel that complies with the defined quality specification. It is produced from renewable or waste sources, and it complies with the sustainability criteria of the CORSIA that Pedro will tell you more about. Once we comply with the 3 criterion, we have 11 technological routes, including processing for SAF, and those routes are important from the perspective of the offer of raw materials and for how our region is positioned with high availability of those raw materials. The route that we have developed is the commercial route. For those of you that come from the biodiesel world, you have heard about the HEFA that uses oils and fats, the EFA route, and of course those are oils and fat. The second route, which is very developed, is the alcohol to jet route. We know of this value chain because Latin America produces 87% of bioethanol in the world, and for that it uses sugar, cane, and specific cereals, in particular corn, that has a percentage of over 60% of fermentable starches. So the great advantage in the continent and in Latin America in particular is that it has multiple industries connected to oil. It exports over 40% of all oil in the world, and we have large corn producers such as the United States, and it has the biggest producer of sugar cane, which is Brazil. So from the position of raw food, we have multiple advantages. And that number that you saw in the pie chart about the need to decarbonize 65% of emissions in aviation by using SAF is translated into this estimate of having the world produce a large amount of SAF by 2050 for 149 million kilotons actually, and it seems like quite a lot. And we see the red line, that is the added biodiesel and bioethanol added production. We are producing a large quantity of biodiesel and bioethanol. So we have over 70 countries across the world that have mandates for the use of biodiesel and bioethanol. So the conclusion that I want to reach to here is that except for Brazil, that had a very successful experience with bioethanol in the 50s, the rest of the world started doing biofuels at grand scale since the year 2000. So it took us about 20 to 23 years to create an industry that will consume over 150 million cubic meters, but now we need to create an industry that is 3 times larger than the biofuel industry that we have now. So this is the challenge for us, and this is the opportunity for the region as well. Thank you.
Y muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. Just to recap in the first graph that I discussed within the decarbonization strategies for the region, we are focused on the largest efforts in the sector. And what that means is that we need to make investments through the creativity of airlines. We are trying to work with new technologies such as electrical and hybrid airplanes. Were using hydrogen as a new source of fuel, but it will take about 10 years for those technologies to mature and to be used by airline manufacturers across the world. We can also make improvements at the land level and at the airspace level. We can make many improvements as well in that area. So the most feasible solution that we have right now that does not require changes in technology is the development of SAF fuels. But as Agustin was saying, and for that I like to show you how much biofuel is being produced and what is the growing demand. This doesn't mean that we are replacing other sectors that need to be stabilized, such as the transport sector, but rather we need to add to the supply that is already existing and quadruple the current production of biofuels at the international level. Now, if we look at the production routes of the SAF, since we started operating in 2016 when we introduced the first technical regulations that define the viable routes for the production of fuel, we have seen a step-by-step process for SAF production, but it is limited given the related cost of the production of that fuel. The total demand of SAF for the region, although it's 65% for the next 28 years, doesn't even make up 0.05% of the total. So what that means is that if we want to develop this industry in the next 27 years, we need to have raw materials available without displacing other industries that are already operating, while also meeting the sustainable development criteria that I will discuss later on. Now, the first challenge is not about the technology. We understand the technology, we understand the raw materials, we can certify the raw materials. So the challenge is having the political will to develop state public policies to have sustainable fuels in aviation. What happens is that as a new industry, especially in an area that is so regulated, national policies need to have changes for the specifications of the SAF. As you know, international fuel needs to meet the standards of the ASTM for aviation. So the first step needs to be introducing the technical specs of the SAF within the value chain at the national level. Why? Because nowadays SAF is a drop-in fuel, and that means that it is mixed with conventional fuel up to 50%. Obviously, the goal of the industry is to operate flights with 100% SAF in the next 6 years. However, given the technologies available to us, the older airplanes cannot have an increase of that mix to get close to 50%, but rather we need to have a balance between paraffins and the other fuels to actually have combustion within the different engines.
Other challenges that we also have are also the price versus supply relationship. As part of the conventional fuels, SAF is 2 or 3 times more expensive than conventional fuel. And the question is, who is going to pay the price? Of course, here we are looking for mechanisms for incentives to the industry in order to be able to have a parity that will never exist, but at least to try to strike a balance with the price that is being paid for SAF and the price that is paid by the clients of aviation in their daily lives. And lastly, also the competition that can exist with other sectors. This is a very important point for the Americas region because obviously, despite being one of the regions that has a lot of experience in bioethanol and biofuels, as could be in Colombia or Brazil, the aviation industry is stuck in a way on the fact that fuels for aircraft have to sustain the sustainability criteria that we have adopted as an industry. So I always say that the most important letter in SAF is the S. In terms of public policies, I'm going to start to talk a bit about the different challenges that I said before. There's two ways to go into public policies to foster SAF. There's models that have been boosted by Europe. Europe has a policy of mandates in order to promote the use of SAF. We don't have a position against mandates as long as it comes with incentives, because mandates in the end has some competitive disadvantages. On the one hand, it puts in danger the research and development of new technologies through mandates. So we are just concentrating in monoproduction rather than pluriproduction with different raw materials. We see it in countries such as Colombia, where the mandate for biodiesel has been concentrating only in the production of palm oil and sugars. And so there isn't an incentive for producers to invest in new technologies. You just have to comply with a certain quota, and that's it. The second point is the other way of production of SAF is through incentives that come from tax incentives. It has been developed in countries such as the US, one of the main sources of SAF nowadays. But what happens? Who pays for the tax incentive? At the end of the day, it is the everyday person, and in the Latin American level, we can't have that tax load in the social sphere for the development of SAF, an industry that in the end is considered a essential public service. So how do we develop public policies at the Latin American level? Obviously, the proposals that we're making for that, we have the General Secretary of the ICLES here today. We try to see which mechanisms can be implemented in order to boost this industry and try to have tax exemptions for an industry that doesn't exist. Now we have the biodiesel, we have taxes for conventional jets, so we can exonerate SAF from that production for at least 10 years, an industry that doesn't exist. Lots of countries would cover up to 25% of the cost of fuel. The others are incentives for producers, for agriculture producers, those who can collect and provide new jobs in this way. We have aspects also, as was mentioned in the morning, of how to evaluate the risk of this type of investment, how we improve the investment risk in Latin American countries in order to attract foreign capital, whether it's multilateral banks, investment funds, or private capital, but always protecting that investment in our countries. So where are we at now? I always show this slide because we see that the biggest concentration of policies on SAF is located in developed countries, which means that we are again seeing a transition towards the creation of new technologies where the rich take the raw materials from the poor countries and they produce it in the rich countries, and then we import it to our countries with our own raw material, but at a high price. So what does energy transition mean for aviation? It means energy independence. Only 23 countries internationally produce oil nowadays. Out of those 23 countries, they contain 95% of all the jet fuel that is supplied internationally. The SAF can be produced locally, breaking that energy dependence that we have today with the oil-producing countries, specifically in the Middle East, where we now have a war which we don't know what level it will have and how it could affect the supply, also with a war between Ukraine and Russia. So if we try to find independence in this sense, there can be a political purpose that we can boost. Countries such as Brazil nowadays are discussing in Congress right now a bill that would foster SAF from 2026, a production that is not necessarily focused in a volume objective, but rather decarbonization objectives, reduction of the carbon footprint of fuel for 2026, starting with a project, and of course the use of SAF. Countries such as Colombia already have an order by a climate law that started in 2021, where there is a call for work in this sense and the creation of a roadmap for SAF in the country. But also countries like Chile and Mexico are also evaluating viability of producing it in their own countries. Of course, other countries in the region could also start to have this discussion. Argentina is one of them, given the experience that they have in terms of biofuels. And I mention biofuels a lot because, of course, SAF can be produced, I've since said it, with the technical routes that we already have for biofuels. Of course, that we need to be training in the plants in order to have the production of SAF, and it could be one of the sub-products within the production of biofuels. I'm not going to go into this topic because I think I already said it, but the most important part of SAF is the story that we can tell, the diversification of the economies, the industries that can be created, the creation of new jobs, of course, the regional development and of the countries at the Latin American level. But as this is as long as we have these are 13 sustainability criteria that we have up to 2023, sorry, we just focused on the reduction of greenhouse gases, but starting from 2024, SAF has to comply with another 11 fundamental objectives, and these objectives are focused directly on the environmental sphere and the impact that SAF has. So focusing on the development, on the impact on the earth, on the air and conservation, and the reduction of greenhouse gases, but also in the social spheres, not to expropriate land from farmers, not to use lands that were part of armed conflicts at some point. We have a lot of that in the region. And of course, we don't have to compete with the food safety in the region. So these topics would start in 2024. And the COSIA is a mechanism of compliance that is not compulsory for states that are not part of it. The idea is to develop the SAF industry based on the sustainability criteria that we already have at an international level. We don't want to have a difference between a SAF being sustainable with this criteria that we have here, and we don't want that to be the same as a SAF that is not based on the international standards that we have adopted as an industry. We could use that, but it would be subject to political questioning and also social questioning regarding the quality and if aviation is really having a fair transition, which is a word that we are using nowadays in the region. So I was saying 11 because there is a fundamental point, which is the seismic impact regarding CAF. So for the low carbon aviation fuels, it's not necessarily a SAF, it is a fuel that is 100% petrol, but there's processes in that reduce the carbon footprint by 5%, and it can be increased up to 10% in the practices that we are trying to have nowadays. I'm going to finish because everything we've seen is what I call a top-to-bottom approach. We know how to reach the 50. We know the strategies, but in June 2023, the roadmaps were presented for how to reach that. So we analyzed from the base how to achieve the objectives of 2050. So there's those roadmaps. There's not just one unique approach. It's suggestions for policies and actions that can be taken. We're not saying that it's the only way to reach decarbonization, but these are different goals that we need to reach for 2050. Directly focusing on what we need today in order to achieve the decarbonization goals and how to reach those decarbonization goals, taking into consideration that we have 130 goals that we've established for the 2050 year, and focusing on infrastructure, the development of SAF, new technologies, the part of public policies, which needs to be developed by the governments, and the most important part, which is financing. I think that in the end, financing costs $5 billion in the next years, and so that means it is $180,000 of investment each year in energy transition. And so we have to talk again about who pays the bill. But what defines these roadmaps, the analysis that the research team at the IATA made, is that if we don't take these actions and we don't comply with these intermediate objectives, what it means is that the development of SAF internationally can be affected by the actions of public policies. So the black lines represent how much SAF we can develop with that support and that compliance of those objectives. And without them, as you can see, we will depend mostly on efforts that come from outside the sector. We will continue to depend on the investment in carbon bonds because we don't have enough investments in new technologies, hydrogen, operations, etc. And the summary, sorry that I went a bit over time. Just as the aviation industry cannot do it, we have to have a value chain within the sector, working directly with airports, with corporate clients, the developers of new technologies, but also at the same time, producers have to be open to the governments and try to touch sectors that we normally don't affect as aviation. So ministries of infrastructure, of the environment, we don't always do this, and we have to continue to work with also the energy and mining ministries, which again, in aviation, we don't really get involved with these ministries in general. And obviously to continue with the efforts in the ministries of transport. So this would be the end, and I'm going to now welcome the panel, and let's begin with Secretary General of the ICLAC, Jaime Binder, who is representing, well, it is the Latin American Commission of Civil Aviation, the director of the NACIA, which is the Aeronautical Authority of Uruguay. Then we will continue with Fernando Liverman, who is from Aerolíneas Argentinas, Argentinian Airlines. Young Grestin, the Vice President of Strategy and International Affairs of Airbus. It is a company of international aviation. And then I'm going to have as well Agustín Taraba from the ICA International Cooperation Institute.
I am not going to sit down. I think I've been sitting for too long now. So we have had a conversation about the SAF and about the challenges for us. So the question is, how do we tackle them as governments, and what are the regulation and political opportunities in the region to foster this in aviation? No, I apologize, we cannot hear the speaker. It is not working. No. Good morning. No? Now you can hear me. Good morning, and thank you for providing me with this opportunity to participate in this panel. I'm the Secretary of the Latin American Commission of Civil Aviation, and I'm here together with the President of that organization as well. The CLAC is an organization similar to OLADE. It's open to the member states of Latin American and Caribbean states, and as OLADE, it has over 50 years of existence. We were created in a meeting of authorities. We bring together 22 aviation authorities of the region. And I want to go straight into the discussion that you posed. We are talking about sustainable growth, and I want to stop at the word growth because there are concerns from the aviation authorities. The approach that we have in the region is that airline transportation needs to grow. First, it was for the elite only, and we want it to grow. I won't explain why, but I will say that it creates social and economic development for the region. That's the first step. Then, airline transport needs to grow in a sustainable way, and that's why 2 years ago we got together here, all the authorities in an assembly, and the CLAC issued a resolution about how we can achieve this and how staff can make this feasible in our sector. And this resolution is recommendation to our states. What it says is that in the long term we need to have a legal framework for investment. In the short term, we want equality with other industries and sectors pertaining to the incentives afforded. And mostly we want the risks of investment to be decreased. So that's clear. We have a global consensus for us. We have spoken about the OAC, the Specialized United Nations organization for the sector, and they have provided us with the regulations that will enable us to get those investments. We have CORSIA, as Pedro explained. CORSIA allows us to use that framework to apply SAF and certify them. This is a great path ahead for us. And then we have LTAG. LTAG is a global agreement for the decarbonization for 2050. This was previously done by the industry. The IATA and other sectors have said this before, and the states in the OASI have said the same. So there is a consensus between the regulators and those that are regulated in terms of what we have to do. But then we arrive at a paradox. And that's that although the airline industry agrees in terms of regulators and regulated, and although we have regulations to develop the SAF industry, it's not produced. Latin America has incredible competitive advantages, but because of investment issues, SAF will be produced in the developed world and not here, albeit here is where we have the raw materials necessary. So how do we do everything? How can we have aviation grow? How can we have that aviation grow sustainably using SAF is a big challenge. And this is not simple. We know we will not get subsidies as incentives here, but we could get tax incentives for sure. And therein lies the second paradox. We have this great agreement, but we cannot be part of government agendas. We cannot We cannot meet them. What is the agenda that we're interested in? Well, the one of the Ministries of Finance and the one of the Ministries of Energy. The airline authorities are aware of this. The transport ministers know this, but because we are competing with governments, we cannot become part of the public agenda. So there will be an OASI meeting soon. We want to send a message to the world that we can have these investments, and we will continue preaching so we can be part of the government's agendas, because we believe this is a central topic that allows for social and economic development by developing SAF. But we have the Cassandra syndrome. We're preaching this, but nothing is happening in Latin America and the Caribbean. Thank you. Thank you, Jaime. You mentioned something that is fundamental. And that's the relationship with government and different areas of governments. So the question is, what are the specific actions that we can take from your point of view as the maximum authority of civil aviation in Uruguay to move forward with SAF? And another fundamental thing is, how can we make this sector competitive? We have developed countries that will be deploying airlines with SAF, and then that may lead to stigma, saying, hey, I'm cleaner, I operate cleaner airplanes because I use SAF. Thank you, everyone. As Pedro said, I am the Director of Civil Aviation in Uruguay, but also the most important position that I have is that I am the President of the Civil Aviation Latin American Commission. So I have a responsibility not just with Uruguay, but also with the other 22 countries that make up the CLAC, which is the Civil Aviation Organization of Latin America and the Caribbean. Now, I want to paraphrase Fito Páez when he said that it's pouring over the rain. It is fine for it to pour over rain puddles. That is, we want the term SAF to be repeated in the agenda. We want to grind that concept into all the government's agendas, and we should work on 4 large pillars that we have been discussing for a very long time. We have the 2030 and 2050 goals, yes, but we have to focus on 4 large pillars to achieve them. First, we have technology and innovation. Then we have the regulations, and that is where states need to be innovative and work quickly so that the regulations can protect us as well as incentivize us. Then we need to have human resources, training, and working with that human resource that needs to come into the sector. And then last but not least, we need financing. So as an aviation authority, what we see is that the different stakeholders that we need to manage, and that we as a state are responsible for interacting with them, such as operators from airline companies, the crew of the airlines, and the different members of the human resources of the aviation sector need to be known to us. We need to talk to them if we want to meet our goals. We need to understand that these are not easy to achieve goals. We have 0.1% of obtained product out of all the product that we will need to consume. We also spoke about technology, and the question is, how can we, as part of the government and as the Bureau of Aviation, have an impact on technology? Well, we need to coordinate roundtables, we need to create forums, and every time that we can create an interaction with the industry, with the government, or with the operators, we need to discuss this. If we go back to the global market mentioned before, we know that geopolitically there is a division between the North and the South in terms of these technologies. So we need to have a conversation in which the regulations can respond to this issue. We need to convince ourselves and everyone of what we want to be. Do we want to be sectors that produce raw materials so that the real energy can be produced in the north? Or do we want to be added value generators for the region to have our governments grow and to benefit our peoples? Well, if we want to be the second thing, we need to have updated regulations and updated laws, and that is connected to the other pillar, which is the pillar of the incentive. As Jaime explained, there is a paradox for us. Who will carry the burden of paying for this? Will the incentive come from the government, and how will it come? You mentioned this some minutes ago. If I tally everything and the incentive is a tax exemption, the end user will eventually have to pay that. Will they have to pay for that in the airline ticket? Will they have to pay that in the cost of operations? In the use of fuel? Are we going to increase the cost of fuel? That is the dilemma, and states need to act there. And the airline authority, as the technical organization, needs to provide advice so that the solution is as balanced and as fair as possible for end users, because Latin America is different from other regions of the world. The airline sector requires connectivity. Connectivity is a word that we have been hearing quite a lot at the regional level. Uruguay, Argentina, Brazil, Colombia, Peru, Ecuador, Chile, Paraguay. We all need connectivity because we have mountains, we have rainforests, we have deserts, and it's hard for us to reach point A from point B. It's not the same as hopping on a train in Lisboa and going to Moscow, then trying to get from Montevideo to Santiago. We don't have a train. Same thing happens in the Caribbean, so we need connectivity in the region. And in order for us to have connectivity within this new paradox of knowing that sustainable fuel is going to be more expensive, it's going to be from 4 to 6 times more expensive than fossil fuels, I need to create a regulation, and that regulation needs to be balanced. It needs to look at geopolitical issues, look at what we need to do in terms of having new human resources, and we need to find investment strategies that hopefully the investors will see an advantage of making exemptions until the sector is developed, because the benefits will come later. We need to develop first. Thank you, Leonardo, for that. What I like about Spanish here and about how rich our Spanish language is that we can talk about sustainability of aviation, but we are also talking about sustainability of the sector and the competitivity of the sector. And we need to be clear on regional differences. In Europe, and I'm sorry that I'm using France as an example, last year a law was approved where all flights that take less than 3 hours are suspended. People need to use a train. Why? Because there is another public transportation alternative. But when we look at the geography, as you mentioned, of the region, we know first that we do not have the public transport means developed to have alternatives for passenger transport. And even if we did have it, some routes are impossible. The Medellin-Bogota route is the most profitable route for all the airlines operating in Colombia, a country that has over 48 million inhabitants. However, albeit connectivity between both cities takes less than an hour, if you go through land, you don't have a train, it takes 8 hours to get there by car or by bus on a good day where traffic allows for that. If not, it can be between 12 to 16 hours. So public transport and the service provided by aviation is not just a luxury service as was considered previously, but is rather now a essential public transport service in the connectivity of many regions. Another fundamental point is that we support over 3% of all the financial activity in Chile, and especially 95% of all the products that are exported through aviation. Some of them are perishable foods such as salmon that people love in North America, that travels from Punta Arenas or Puerto Montt all the way to North American restaurants so that it is fresh. And what allows for that to happen is aviation. So as we try to find sustainability, we need to balance that with financial sustainability. And that is why we're going to ask Fernando about the actions that you are making as an airline to decarbonize aviation. Good morning, and thank you, Olade, and thank you to the IATA and the Uruguayan authorities for inviting us to this event. Of course, the position that I will discuss is the position of a client and operator. But I would like to take just 1 minute to give you some context about the situation of Aerolíneas Argentinas. Aerolíneas is a state-owned company. The major stakeholder is the Argentinian state. In international forums, Argentina has stated its position about sustainable development, and it has done that through the framework conventions of the United Nations. Within that context, the 2030 agenda is contemplated in Argentina through Law 27-50, where we ratify our commitment with sustainable, resilient development with low carbon emissions. Aerolíneas Argentinas, as part of our state, has developed a sustainability policy in which environmental awareness is one of the pillars, but we also support our policy in corporate stability, guaranteeing the well-being of people and guaranteeing the connectivity of all Argentinians in the region, because we're trying to support the development of regional economies. So since we're talking about energy, I want to talk about environmental awareness. We, as an airline, have 3 levers that we use for that development. One is technology. And that has to do with renewing our fleet with airplanes that have less emissions. Through Boeing, we are renewing our fleet with the MX and the NGs. We are close to replacing the E2 ones for E2s, and with Airbus, we're trying to include the 330neo on land. We are renewing all the different elements that use fossil fuels for renewable fuel vehicles, tractors, for example, or carts. The second additional lever is our fuel efficiency program that was created some years ago as an opportunity to save money, but right now we're changing our paradigm in our operations. So the approach of pilots, and I am actually a pilot of one of the lines of Aerolíneas Argentinas, is for us to understand that what we're doing is administering a resource that goes beyond economy, and it has to do with the fact that our actions can collaborate with decreasing our carbon footprint. All of our pilots, by the end of their flights, have a program in their tablets where they can assess their own flight and their own performance and continue finding room for improvement in the new procedures to come. And the third topic is the SAF. In Aerolíneas Argentinas, our highest governance body is a sustainability committee made up of directors and operators. We have a portfolio of over 150 initiatives, and our sustainability committee determines the priorities of those projects. For 2023, we have decided to have our first SAF flight We had it knowing that it would be difficult, but we were able to assess each of those issues, and we were able to map and trace out what those obstacles would be. First, we had to obtain SAF, and that was an interesting adventure. We had to think about where to do it, if we would be flying from Ezeiza, or if we would use it coming from Europe. Obviously, doing that from Buenos Aires meant we had to import SAF, and from the logistical point of view, that was truly expensive operation. So we went for the CEPSA provider from Spain, and we had this flight with 2% of blend of SAF. The technical team of Aerolíneas Argentina was in contact with the Airbus technical team to plan this flight, and on September the 14th, we were able to carry out this flight, and now we are assessing the flight from the technical perspective, and we have identified logistical issues, and that has given us really great input to plan future operations that are similar. Now, in general terms, the things that we have come across is one, the fact that we do not have SAF available here, and it is not simple to obtain it in the midterm, and we should define what midterm is anyway. We have logistical issues, of course, and then we have the issue of cost. For us, in an operation that gives us marginal profits, tripling our costs seems to be an impossible task. So we want to access SAF. We have the will to do it, but at this point, we cannot do it because of the costs.
Porque tienes la parte más.
Okay, Agustin, you have the perspective of the producer, but before that, Guido, I will talk to you. You are one of the main manufacturers of airplanes at the international level, so you as Airbus, what are the actions that you're taking to make sure that airlines can meet their environmental objectives by using SAF? Thank you, Pedro. Thank you for introducing me, and thank you, Elade, for inviting me. I am French. I'm trying to hide my accent, but I don't know if I am. Now, from the perspective of the manufacturer, I want to talk about decarbonization in general before I go into SAF. When we're talking about decarbonization, we need to innovate a lot in investment, and as a manufacturer, we work with all the possibilities to reduce emissions at the technological level. Although there are no magical recipes to decarbonize aviation, the panel represents the vision and the position of aviation in general, which is that if SAF is the solution, the most sustainable and the most available solution in the short, mid, and long term, then we need to get it. But before I talk about that, I wanted you to know that we have looked at all the possibilities for innovating and decarbonizing. As manufacturers, we will continue looking for improvements in the efficiency of our airplanes so that they might have a reduced environmental impact. We are making aerodynamical improvements. You have seen that the airplanes have shacklets in the wings, and they allow for us to reduce up to 5% the emissions. Now we will continue doing that and innovating through better aerodynamic options and better wings to reduce emissions more and more. But at the same time, we're looking at more disruptive innovations.
Invertimos bastante en un proyecto que hemos.
We invested in the zero emissions project by using hydrogen. Hydrogen does not emit CO2, but this is an immense technological challenge for us, and it implies a challenge at the ecosystem level as well. So the use of hydrogen is a solution for aviation, but it's not a short-term solution. It's a small mid-term solution, maybe a long-term solution, and it can only be used for part of our products. Because if we're talking about long distance, long haul airplanes, the challenge is even bigger. So what we want is sustainable aviation fuels. And we coincide with the vision of the IATA in terms of us being able to meet our decarbonization goals of decarbonizing 2/3 of the aviation system by 2030. So what we do is we have 4 areas of technological impact. We act on the demand, we act on the supply, and we act at the regulation level and at the technology level. At the technology level, we want our airplanes not to limit the option of using the SAF. People spoke about the limitation of only being able to use SAF by 50% because of the certification of the blend, but we are committed to having all of our planes, both commercial planes as well as military airplanes and helicopters, because our group also manufactures helicopters, to be able to use 100% SAF before 2030. That is our commitment. That is what we're working for, because we do not want our airplanes to be a limiting factor for the use of SAF. Now, of course, we need demand so that we can further produce SAF. Now, as a manufacturer, we use kerosene because every year we deliver over 700 airplanes a year. So for each delivery, we need close to 3 test flights, and then we need to send them to where they're going to be operated. So we're using more and more SAF in those test flights, and as of this year, we're offering our clients 5% of SAF per airplane delivery, and for some clients, AirPlus is offering a bit more. Some clients pay a bit more, and with LATAM, we entered into an agreement so that they can use 49% of SAF in the delivery of their new plane.
Poquito porque estamos hablando.
Of course, it's not that much because it's one flight at a time, but little by little, that means that if we were an airline, we would be at the top 5 of the largest SAF users in the world, because it's 3.4 million gallons of SAF, so it's about 10 million liters a year. This is costly for us, but we believe it is necessary to develop SAF at the global level. Now, at the level of supply, and this is not included in the slide, but there's one thing that is important, is that the goal of the manufacturers should also be supporting and leveraging the manufacturing of SAF at the global level. We have began researching SAF manufacturing projects in the world, and we're trying to see where we can have a larger impact. We have announced some agreements that we have entered into. We want to enter into agreement with DG Fuel in the States. We have a partnership with them to support their technology, and we have a SAF use agreement as well. We also have an agreement with Qantas in Australia, and obviously we're looking at this in Latin America because we see potential here. But mostly we want to see where there is an impact for us, where there's demand, and when there are regulations available. So that leads me to the 4th point, which is regulations. Regulation is absolutely key. That awards us trust, it awards us security. Having regulations makes us believe that the investments in the sector will be long-lasting. So we also want to support that area, and we are working with the IATA on that. We are trying to develop investments. We signed an agreement with the Clean Flights Association or Vuelo Limpio Association to foster regulations. We are working with the IATA to develop a proposal for future fuels for Brazil, and we are supporting them to develop regulations. In Colombia, we're also developing SAF regulations, which is called Clean Sky Regulation. So we're doing everything we can to have a regulatory framework that might be inclusive for the development of the industry. So we want to continue contributing because we believe that sustainable aviation fuels are the priority solution for our decarbonization and to meeting the net zero goals of 2050. Well, in your comments, you spoke about long-haul flights, and I want to highlight that although domestic aviation, for example, in Brazil, could represent over 75% of emissions in the sector in Brazil, we should also consider the impact of long-haul aviation that provides us connectivity with other countries across the world. And although we're talking about electrical airplanes and hybrid airplanes and the use of hydrogen in our technologies, we don't have a solution for international flights and long-haul flights. We're talking about airplanes that have over 250, close to 270 passengers, and we need connectivity for financial development. And in that regional connectivity is where we have 42% of our emissions coming from those flights. So we need to move that into SAF. Yes, totally. And the Zero Y project that announced that we will try to have a hydrogen airplane by 2035. It will be a small, right, airplane, and it will have a short scope, right? Only 1,000 nautical miles. So it doesn't actually deal with the issue because we need to develop this technology further, and that will take a very long time. And another point worth mentioning that supports the idea that SAF is a long-term solution is that nowadays when we sell airplanes, we're talking about airplanes that will be delivered between 2030 and 2035, new airplanes that will be delivering up to 2035. Airplanes have a useful life of close to 20 to 25 years. So those airplanes with today's technology are going to be on the air in 2060, 2070, and the only way for us to decarbonize them is using sustainable aviation fuels. It's interesting what you said about the demand. In general, and given the people that I see in the audience, most of them are producers. They are representative of producers' unions. And we always talk about the demand. We talk about what demand will we have from the aviation sector, and people reflect on this. But I would say that every drop of the over 300 million liters produced in 2022 was bought, and nowadays international aviation has invested over $47 billion in agreements to purchase SAF in the future in productions that are now non-existent. They are non-binding agreements because the risk of investment is significant, but those are commitments of airlines. There are airlines that are investing in their own projects so they can ensure their income in SAF. But now if we go into production and we focus in Latin America, Agustin, from the perspective of the ICA, how do you see the potential of the region, and what are the technical spaces where we can develop this? We have a high agricultural value in the region, but we also need to protect our territory. So how do you see the production of SAF in this context? Well, going back to your previous point about the offer and the supply, all of us who studied economy know that, oh, demands create supply. When we look at these 300 million liters and we wonder, is that too much? Is this very little? And we compare that to jet fuel, well, it's very little, and it's less than what Paraguay produces of bioethanol every year, that produces 500 million liters. So it's a matter of offer, indeed. And in that sense, the region is privileged, as I mentioned in the as you mentioned in the presentation. The region is the main producer and exporter of raw materials for the production of biojet or the SAF. It also guarantees food safety. And for you to get an idea, Latin America exports more biological raw materials than the United States, Canada, and the EU combined. And in that sense, from the production perspective and from the value chain perspective, we have a clear advantage, and that's the S in SAF, which is sustainability. We have an advantage because the region has been exporting bioethanol and biodiesel that are certified, especially to the EU, but also to other markets that have very similar sustainability criteria, similar to those of Corsia, and they demand traceability for the value chain with very similar criterions and with similar certifications. Most of our biofuels are exported with the IECC certificates, which is one of the protocols that can be used in other parts of the world. So what I would say is that we can produce SAF in a sustainable way, but in order for us to do that, we need to have regulations. Now, regulations are not an issue because they are non-existent. The EU and the states don't have a framework that is good or bad, and ours is worse. No, it's just that we don't have one. But I also think that that's an advantage because in the topic of SAF, there is a need for us to make progress with regional regulations because the mandate doesn't exist. So we can work on this. We can work at the Mercosur level, at the Andean countries level, at the SICA level, where we have governance mechanisms available. And I'm sorry to go back to biofuels, but today in the ad hoc Mercosur Biofuels Convention, we are trying to see how we can move towards a convergence of biofuels in Mercosur. Now, the advantage is that none of those countries in Mercosur have regulatory frameworks. I mean, Brazil has made progress here, but we have an opportunity for us to start all on the same page from the same starting point, and because of that we can build regulations for SAF that are beneficial for everyone and that they might have a regional overview and perspective. Okay, you spoke about the alternative fuels convention that the OASI will have next week. But here we believe that there are 4 pillars for the declaration of that conference. One is how can we meet our long-term goals for 2050? And how can we establish metrics to reach that goal? The second point is the development of what we as the IATA know as an emissions counting system. We call them book and claim, but we want to go beyond that because the chain of custody of fuel molecules don't only go through that, but we can also use the mass balance, which is how the fuel goes into the industry. And the third fundamental point that was mentioned here is that we shouldn't limit the kind of raw materials that we use. We should diversify the raw materials. And at the level of the IATA, we are agnostic for raw materials. We're not against any raw material as long as they are certified by the standards of sustainability adopted by the industry. But the fourth pillar has to do with training and skill development and knowledge development and transfer, because I come from the academia sector, and when we go to universities and we talk about this topic, I've gone to schools in many countries, and people are concerned about what we're doing in aviation. So the question is, how are we creating skills within the aviation societies, and how are we connecting to academia? What are we doing in that sense? I think I'm off. Can you hear me? Well, I think all the member states of the OASI are going to have a discussion. And in our discussion, we want to arrive at a final declaration, and we would like for the elements of the declaration might incentivize the development of SAF equitably across the world, not just in developed countries. We share some visions, though. In Latin America especially, we consider that being neutral and agnostic is relevant both for raw materials as well as for the methodologies for production. And obviously, those methodologies and raw materials need to be certified, but we shouldn't make limitations. If we find a method of producing SAF in a sustainable way, the SAF could reach the system. We believe with you. You mentioned book and claim. That's a market mechanism that I won't explain. And we think they're good in Latin America, but they have a different vision of book and claim in Europe. For us, we understand this is essential, and that's what we're discussing here. Now, training is difficult. It is easy to say, yes, we need to be skilled, we need to be experts, and we need to do everything that we can to have the human resources necessary for this world of aviation and environment. But I would say that we do not have someone who is an expert in aviation, economy, and environment, because we need to understand the cap and trade systems. We have no expert that knows everything. We have multidisciplinary teams. I remember when I was in Chile in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, it was very difficult for only one person to understand the Corsia. The word SAF is very normal for us, but it's sometimes hard to explain it to other people. What we're trying to do, obviously, is to bring academia into the conversation. We want this to be discussed in universities. We have an emerging market here, but it is very hard to train when the region doesn't have a regulation for it.
Gran desafío, y por supuesto hay que hacerlo.
It is a great challenge, but this is something we need to do. The OASI is very generous in saying that no country should be left behind, and the developed world wants to share their knowledge with us. As a CLAC, we have entered into MOUs with countries such as Singapore, the Emirates, Qatar. Qatar actually provided us with a first training for aviation authorities through a university in Qatar, and that was really positive for us because it allowed us to move forward with understanding very complex topics. So we need to understand SAF, but we also need to understand cap and trade in aviation and how Corsia will be operated, because we will decarbonize through other things, not just through SAF. So what I would say is that SAF has been the chicken and the egg dilemma for many years. But we are breaking that dilemma. Yes, we will have a demand, and that demand comes from self-regulation. Companies such as LATAM are saying, I'm going to buy this. Other companies are going to do that as well. This is a mandate in the developed world. We don't think that that's a good solution in Latin America, because if it's a mandate, the prices are going to skyrocket and the transport will be only for an elite, and that goes against our development. So we need to be bold in our solution. We need to find our own solutions that incentivize the development of SAF, probably through tax exemptions, while we are able to keep airline tickets affordable. The transition cannot be paid for consumers, because if we're doing that, we're putting a mortgage on our future. We won't be developed anymore. So we need to develop a regulation, surely. And this is something we will discuss in our meeting in the Emirates next week. Okay, for your last point, the IATA has collaborated with Airbus and with Boeing for the development of what we know. We know we can produce SAF. We need a regulation framework, but we need to understand where the SAF is coming from, because obviously this is a disruptive industry. You cannot just replace what exists in the local level. For example, for land transportation, or take resources from other industries to produce this fuel. And I want to mention the Mexican example here, and that's that when we started talking about this in Mexico, the first ideas were about using animal fat to produce SAF. And when we started analyzing this with the fuel distributor in Mexico, it turns out that Mexico is the highest global producer of soap and soap bars. So the animal fat produced by the country is used 100% for that industry. So the only way that we had identified to produce SAF, because animal fat is abundant in the country, could not be used, and we had to use other technologies. So Guion, we know that this year we presented a project in Mexico, and we want to work on it. Can you explain it? Capacity building is key. And there's another key element, which is transparency. It is absolutely clear at this point. So education, yes, is necessary. We are working in an emerging industry. We need to have skilled workers, so we need to train them. So the industry can play a role in this. What we saw in Mexico is that this is a country that has capacity, it has a high demand. It is true that at the political level we didn't see a lot of movement. So based on that context, we decided to get together as manufacturers, as IATA, and with an institute that brings together all research centers and the aerospace space level in Mexico and universities, and with the three main airlines in Mexico, Viva Aerobus, Volaris, and Aero Mexico, and launch a contest to study SAF production for and in Mexico. We launched the project. Airlines offered flight tickets so that students could travel and submit their work. And after 2 months, we had many projects available. And after 3 months, we got 42 project proposals, and we identified 18 out of them. And then we had 3 finalists with different projects in Mexico. So that goes to show that this generation is interested in moving towards a more sustainable industry and to focus on the energy transition. And I believe that here we have a role to play in supporting these initiatives. Also, at the level of education and of developing more information, we developed for Latin America an agreement with the MIT in the United States to have forecasts made for carbon policies that consider how that might have an impact on aviation and on other sectors. We're not just considering things from the perspective of aviation, but also from a global perspective. We want to share more information and more data with decision makers so that they might set regulations in place. And then I go back to transparency. At a time where we're just solving that chicken and egg dilemma, we're not competing. On the contrary, we need to share our studies. We can reproduce them. We shouldn't just keep them under lock and key. We need to share all of that. And there's an organization that is doing that through AXEF. And it's developing feasibility studies and initiatives. But they need support. We will be, of course, supporting them. We will be doing something about that in a short time, so we can have transparent feasibility studies so that the energy sector can take that information and make the best decisions in each country. Because, of course, the feasibility for using raw materials in Argentina will be different from those in Brazil and in Ecuador and Peru. So we need that information, and it needs to be delivered transparently. So I fully agree with the topic of education and the transparency of information. This is fully essential. Thank you. We are coming to the end. I know Agustin has another panel at 11. But if you have any questions, if you have any, now's the time. If not, we're done. No?
Sí, hablando un poquito del tema.
When we talk about eligibility of fuels and export markets, from the perspective of demand agreements, yes, they exist. However, they are not long-term agreements, so they do not allow for certainty for project finance projects.
De que esto vaya
Do you see this happening? Especially because there are differences in regulations and incentives in the countries that have made more progress in the regulation. So is there a way for us to provide more certainty for your agreements? I don't think I'm the largest experts, but yes, I think at the level of regulation, the mandates mentioned by Pedro that already exist in Europe entail the obligation for using SAF. It's not a question. You have to use SAF.
SAF en 2000.
You need to have 10% of use of SAF by 2030, and it increases by 70% for 2050. And that's mandatory in Europe. However, not all of that will be produced in Europe. Airlines are going to have to get this from all over the world. So that is another thing to consider. Just to add, there is a Brazilian investment in Paraguay. It is the largest private investment in Paraguay that has sold its production to Europe and the United States. So in Europe, there's a mandate and it helps get SAF.
Una demanda.
So clearly there's a demand for SAF. So the signals for the market are already there. Yes, Camilo. I understand. I apologize. The interpreter does not hear the speaker. I apologize. The speaker is not using a microphone. I do not hear him. Apologies. The speaker continues not using a microphone. I cannot hear him.
Lo tocamos ahorita
We are going to discuss that in the declaration next week, which is that as an industry in general, we are agnostic to the raw materials used. That is a message that comes from the OASI, and that is a strike against the Europeans who are limiting the raw materials available in the markets that could contribute to the decarbonization of aviation, because they are only looking at second and third generation fuels where those fuels are now inexistent. And the second thing that we discussed with investment funds and multilateral banks who are also creating agreements to finance your projects is how can we provide funds for fuels at the general level in aviation. Since SAF is produced in small lots, agreements with airlines are normally spot agreements. You have 100 tons ready? Well, I pay for 100 tons. That's how it's working now. And the long-term agreements are non-binding agreements because the producers cannot ensure the production and the airline cannot ensure that the price of that production in the future, which is right now a mystery, will be financially feasible for the operation of the airline as a whole. So in that sense, in Europe, in England actually, they are assessing contracts for differences. Contracts for differences is new for the industry of renewables. It was used for the production and dosing of wind power and solar power, and the contract for differences ensures a specific price for the product, and the government commits to subsidize any difference. So if in the future the price of that technology increases, the government will pay for that difference, and if it drops, the consumer will have to pay for it. So the contract for difference ensures a risk investment for the future, but at the same time, it doesn't affect the producer who is making the investment or the investor who is going for that difference.
La aviación es tan volátil y
The second thing to consider is that aviation is volatile. We saw that with COVID-19, where 95% of all operations were paralyzed at the international level. Airports were full of airplanes that did not take off.
los contratos de inversiones a largo plazo que pueden hacer las aerolíneas.
So that placed long-term agreements for airlines into perspective. We are now living one day at a time. We have financial statements every 6 months to see the stability of the region. And although the region is leading the revenue passenger kilometers metrics, but still no one is going to say, I am going to ensure a production of 6 million tons for 10 years. No. They are also considering joint uptake agreements. So they're looking at having groups of airlines invest in groups of projects. One is One World, which is the largest, most powerful agreement alliance that includes Emirates, American, and British Airways, and they're trying to develop joint purchase agreements where I can have access to a product from one producer that complies with the requirements established by the union, but at the same time it disrupts the risk of investment in one project. So we have the risk divided. And the third point, and that's included in the declaration, is the point of the development of an international mechanism for measuring emissions. And what we're doing is we're breaking the physical molecule fuel with the environmental benefit of SAF. So the idea is that that environmental value can be given to an airline operating in Thailand, let's say, that cannot access that fuel. So the local molecule is kept here, but the Thailand airline can claim a decrease in emissions. But I won't go into that now because it's a controversial topic indeed. But what matters is that this is a methodology that will support the development of projects in places where the demand is not necessarily growing. Thank you. You were talking about not having mandates. I think we can have a volume mandate or an obligation to decarbonize that promotes the use of fuels, because many times when those mandates are not in place, we don't make progress. That's one relevant thing. And the thing that I wanted to ask you is that you said that the goal of airlines is to grow and to grow sustainably. And it catches my attention that the first goal is not to be sustainable, and that the second is to grow sustainably. I think we're confused. I'm not part of the airlines. I am a regulator. The IATA are airlines with Pedro that has participated greatly in the forum, and we are the CLAC, and we group the regulators. And for a very long time, what we have wanted is for flights to be democratic, for it not just to be for an elite. But we need to do this in a sustainable way. But the dilemma that we have is that we have to do two things in Latin America. We need to continue growing, and we need to grow sustainably. So I'm sorry if I explained myself incorrectly. We want to have airline flights be more democratic. We need to have more passengers, and we need to do that in the midst of an energy transition that will take us to having the planet we want to have. Having said that, mandates might be a good alternative in Europe because they have mandates and subsidies. But in Latin America, we're not going to get subsidies. So what could mandates do is to have airlines be forced to look for SAF where they can't find it. And if they find it, it's going to be very expensive, and that will increase the price of airline tickets, thus going against the development of aviation and the democratization of aviation. And that's the paradox that we need to tackle with our regulation. We cannot copy European regulations. We need to have our own, and that is the big challenge for our regulations. We do have signals in the market. What I understand out of the Mega Green project in Paraguay is that they will be producing using soy. And once again, we are neutral. We want neutrality in terms of raw materials. We don't want to be limited.
Queremos que Latinoamérica se desarrolle no solo porque la aviación es un motor de
And we want Latin America to be developed, not just because aviation is a development engine, but we want to create a SAF industry here. We can all be oil companies in the present. And I'm saying that between inverted commas because we can produce fuel that is clean, and we are facing the historical opportunity of developing SAF in the region. Okay, we have gone quite over time once again. Thank you. Round of applause.
Y agradecemos.
Thank you to Olade for the space. Thank you for participating. And if you want to ask any more questions, we'll be here. Thank you.